I'm going to read from my book, Mind and Evolution, as assessed through reviews of major texts, The Science and Philosophy of the Organism by Hans Driesch, 1907. Driesch stands in modern time as the preeminent advocate of vitalism, specifically for the kind he called entelechy, a term he adapted from Aristotle. With Driesch, we are in the company of an intellect equally at home with philosophy, both ancient and modern, German idealism and the British empiricists, as with the strict requirements of the scientific method, especially as it involved his own specialty of dissecting sea urchin embryos. I relished being able to shelter briefly in the austere sweep of his thinking. What I understood of it I was deeply impressed by, but ultimately you need a better guide than me to uncover all its secrets. Here's what I understood. In what was known about life in his time, he looked for what could not be accounted for by a purely mechanical account of life. My estimate of his achievements: 2 failures, 1 success. His failures came from what he could not know: how the immune system works, and that the specifications for the generation of the whole creature lay entire within each cell of its body, in the form of the genome in the cell's nucleus and its protoplasm. In his day, it was reasonable to conclude, quote, "The form of an atom or molecule can never be that of a lion or a monkey. To assume that would be to go beyond the limits of chemistry in chemistry itself." But he was wrong. The form of the monkey does lie in the monkey's chromosomes. Despite his brilliance, subsequent discoveries have invalidated much of his thinking, but what I call his one success deserves consideration. I'll limit myself to that. Basically, he found that embryos act not as collections of parts, of individual cells, for example, but as wholes. When he dissected away one of the 2 cells an embryo first divided into, or 1 or 2 of the 4 cells it next became, what remained would grow into an entire adult, though perhaps reduced in size. Further, when he cut simple multicellular animals into pieces, those pieces could grow back to reconstitute the entire adult. Quote, "We have an ectoderm of the gastrula of a starfish here before us. We know that we may cut off any part of it in any direction, and that nevertheless a differentiation of the ectoderm may go on perfectly well and result in a typical little embryo which is only smaller in its size than it would normally be." His conclusion: the plan of the whole creature is not defined by the parts it consists of, but is distributed throughout it. This associates his thinking with holism. We now know, as he couldn't, as I pointed out above, that the specifications of the entire creature do lie in every copy of the genome, in the nucleus of every one of its cells. But some of the questions his work raised remain unanswered. How can individual genomes in separate cells impose on matter the form it needs to grow and divide to rebuild the entire whole creature, even if the arrangement of these cells becomes disturbed? Quote, "But we know that, at least in our harmonious equipotential systems, quite another process occurs after parts have been taken away. The development that occurs is not fragmental, but whole, only on a smaller scale." He puzzled over what kind of machinery could be responsible for such repairs, but, quote, The assumption of the existence of such a machine proves to be absolutely absurd in the light of the experimental facts. A machine, typical with regard to the three chief dimensions of space, cannot remain itself if you remove parts of it, or if you rearrange its parts at will. Here's another nice conundrum. Divide one of these simple multicelled creatures in two, and what were adjacent and presumably similar cells on the now cut edges will know how to reconstitute in one case the missing head, in the other the missing tail. How do these cells know what part of the body is missing, how to fix it, and how to stop when the missing part has been completely restored? This is the essence of the challenge Driesch presents to modern evo-devo. Note further that this process is completely different from how the missing part was originally made as part of the growth of the whole. In his research, he found that one of his test subjects had three separate mechanisms with quite different properties by which reconstitution could be brought about. Quote, a species of the flatworm planaria was found to restore its totality out of small pieces, either by regeneration proper if the pieces were fed, or by a sort of rearrangement of material if they were kept fasting. The pharynx, if it is too large for a piece that is cut out, may be differentiated back and be replaced by a new pharynx, which is smaller. Even in vertebrates, a missing eye may be forged out of the lens, a completely different process than how the eye originally came about. In general, Driesch concludes, life, at least morphogenesis, is not a specialized arrangement of inorganic events. Biology, therefore, is not applied physics and chemistry. Life is something apart, and biology is an independent science. Driesch is not quick to label himself a vitalist. What we have proved to be true has always been called vitalism. Vitalist views in biology have arisen in rather numerous forms during the last 15 years. Especially in Germany, Gustav Wolff states that the existence of so-called primary purposefulness, that is, the existence of adaptive processes which cannot be imagined to have arisen on Darwinian principles, is able to prove vitalism. But I say it only proves teleology, which is a broader concept than vitalism. So let us borrow our terminology from Aristotle, and let that factor in life phenomena, which we have shown to be a factor of true autonomy, be called entelechy. The capabilities involving repair that Driesch identified in living tissues still pose thorny problems for any purely mechanical theory of evolution. How could a mechanism repair evolve that, in the case of specific injuries, would be invoked only very seldom, the earlier stages of which would not provide any of the fitness provided by the intact organ? This is perhaps only a variation of the creationist favorite argument against the modern theory of evolution. They claim some parts of living creatures are irreducibly complex. That is, any earlier stages by which those parts might evolve would be invisible to natural selection, because they wouldn't offer to it any part of the fitness imparted by the whole. But Driesch's example is more demanding than that, simply because the need for specific repairs would occur so seldom that any initial repair apparatus would appear to natural selection as suggesting disuse to be eliminated. Of natural selection, Driesch says it is as if someone who is asked the question, why is this tree covered with these leaves, were to answer, because the gardener did not cut them away. Of course, that would explain why there are no more leaves than there actually are, but it never would account for the existence and nature of the existing leaves as such. It must be certain from the very beginning of analysis that natural selection, as defined here, can only eliminate that which cannot survive, what cannot stand the environment in the broadest sense, but that natural selection never is able to create diversities. It always acts negatively only, never positively. Drawing on Aristotle, to consider natural selection as a positive factor in descent would be to confound the sufficient reason for the non-existence of what is not with the sufficient reason of what is. To this sort of contingency of being as maintained by Darwinians, criticism has objected, as we know, that it is quite an impossible basis of a theory of descent, since it would explain neither the first origin of an organ nor any sort of harmony among parts or among whole individuals, nor any sort of restitution processes. Despite his efforts, Driesch sadly concludes, "We said that transformism might one day be proved to be true evolution, governed by one immanent principle, which then would have to be regarded as a new primary factor in nature. But we did not know the least about that principle."